Jocelyn Ulrich is the Vice President of Policy and Research at the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, Pharma. She is responsible for policy analysis and research on issues such as intellectual property, FDA policy, and the value of innovation. Jocelyn, always great to see you, my friend. How are you?
I'm well. Good to see you too, Dwayne.
So nothing going on in D.C. today. Everything's very calm.
Quiet. Calmest it's ever been.
Well, at least you're not lacking work.
This is true. Job security, I guess.
So you and I've always gotten along very well with you. And one of the reasons why is we share a certain odd pathway to the pharmaceutical sector. You were in the opera program at Boston University and studied music at Barnard College. How did you end up moving from there to, checking your bio, moving to Pfizer in 2003? How did that transition occur?
Well, it was a happenstance of fate, I suppose, Dwayne. So as you note, I was in New York. I was trying to be a singer. I was a young artist with Da Capo Opera Theater on the East Side and had graduated from having to pay to sing to not having to pay, but not actually getting paid either.
Living below the poverty line, but doing your art.
Exactly.
Yes.
So I did need to supplement with waiting tables, had done that for years. But I needed a day gig because most of my rehearsals in the opera company were in the evenings and weekends. And so I applied for a temporary position through a placement agency, and they happened to place me at Pfizer. I was there for about a year just doing administrative work and doing my singing at night. And I started to think about what was next in my life and in my career, and was at that point in my singing where I realized to make that next jump, it would require maybe a move to Europe. I had friends who were working in Germany doing some other things, and I took a long, hard look at the career and the stability. And I said, all right, maybe it's time to jump ship here.
Been there, done that.
Yeah. So I started looking around, and I was working with a medical director at Pfizer, a guy named Chuck Nersch.
Oh, wow.
Do you know Chuck?
I know Chuck,
Yeah. And I said, I'm thinking about making a change. And he said, well, if you come on board on my team full time, there's tuition reimbursement. You could think about going back to school, but pharmaceuticals are also a great career. You should think about it. You should join. And so he hired me as an associate, entry level.
Were you at the Death Star on 42nd and Lex?
I was.
You right over at the old corporate tower before they moved. Wow.
Certainly was. And for 9 years. Yeah. So he hired me, and I started working on his team in infectious disease relations. Worked on antibiotics, worked on some sponsored clinical trials, ran some investigator meetings, started learning about research oversight, safety databases. I worked with our clinical research managers, our data managers, and I got to work closely with our worldwide medical affairs team, did some work on HIV. So started learning, and I started thinking, well, actually, this is pretty fascinating. And originally I had thought maybe I'd go back and an MBA and do arts management or do something related to music. But the more I stayed at Pfizer and the more I got to understand the business, the more I really fell in love with the industry and thought this is a great path to land. And so I ended up going back and getting a master's in global public health policy and management at NYU, and ended up staying at Pfizer for 9 years. And
did any in your family, anyone in healthcare at all?
My father was a dentist.
Aha.
My mother was a nurse.
Aha. There had to be, because you have a very natural, intrinsic understanding of how the interaction of various complex actors work in the sector better than, and I don't want to pump you up here, Jocelyn, but better than 95% of the people we deal with. You have an intrinsic understanding of how this damn business works. That's impressive, frankly. It's always a joy to work with you. I don't say that to many of our clients, frankly, but no, honestly, you've understood. I figured. So was it a hard transition then because you've been around it in some respects?
It was and it wasn't. What was really fascinating, and I was actually very lucky to have Chuck and some other mentors early on who brought me into some meetings, and I got to see how they thought about evidence and science, how they made strategic decisions around, do we develop this asset in-house? Do we let an external investigator at an academic research site do an independent project? How do we think about how we develop this? And I got exposure to this full development life cycle team, and having been around people who value evidence and think about clinical practice. My father had his own business,
right.
So there was certainly some of that, but I also just came in with no preconceived notions, and I was just learning everything I could and a real curiosity for it. And so that's what really helped, and I've just been lucky to be able to observe a lot of different facets of the business. I've worked in a small biotech after Pfizer that was in a co-promote with GlaxoSmithKline, and now having been at pharma, getting to look kind of across the industry view. So I've just been lucky to be able to be in different aspects of the business and to be able to ask a lot of questions and observe a lot of things.
You recently testified under oath, under television cameras, C-SPAN, MSNBC, the whole 9 yards. Got grilled by Lindsey Graham. Do you think your experience on stage as a performer is sort of a secret cheat code? Does that give you an advantage, do you think?
I do think so.
Yeah. I admit it wholeheartedly. People say, aren't you nervous when you walk on stage? It's like, hell no. You ever played Mahler 5? It's like, no, this is easy. This is much easier than what I used to do. You know?
Yeah, it's in a certain sense. And I also think being challenged as a singer to find the story and to be able to tell the story, certainly when you're doing policy and advocacy work, it's a very similar skill set. What are we trying to convey and how are we trying to convey it? How do you get that across? So I draw from those skills quite a lot.
Because you look cool as a cucumber, Jocelyn. You really did. You look great, man. You handled that really well. You even got a hard pivot in. I was applauding. So go, girl, go. And on that topic, you were discussing PBMs on that panel. And Lindsey Graham in particular was asking some pretty pointed questions on PBMs. What exactly are the pharmaceutical benefit managers? They're kind of the boogeyman right now. Well, what's your opinion on that?
I think they are third-party companies that manage prescription drug benefits on behalf of insurers, large employers, Part D plans, and they play a very large role in the U.S. healthcare system, and they act as intermediaries between the insurers, the drug manufacturers, and the pharmacies. So they have a role to play. I think the challenge is over the last decade or so, they've consolidated considerably, and now there's 3 PBMs that are controlling 80% of all the prescriptions in the United States. And these are all owned by the same corporate giants that also own the insurers and the pharmacies, and now they're increasingly even buying up local doctors' practices.
Yeah, they're integrating into practice.
They are. And so they can steer patients towards medicines and pharmacies that make them more money regardless of what's best for the patient. So increasingly, Federal Trade Commission, pharma has certainly been doing a lot of work to point that out. This is really creating some real access barriers for patients, and a lot of the burden of paying for a medicine instead of being borne by the payers are being shifted to the patient.
That's a really interesting point, because the hot takes right now around PBMs, the pharmaceutical benefit managers, is related to the rebate issue, because what Medicare is charging is not nearly what either the company is seeing, nor what is being calculated as part of your copay, your out-of-pocket, or your deductible as part of your plan. There's a misunderstanding, a fundamental misunderstanding of the role of rebates and how they interact with premiums. How are you folks here at Pharma dealing with that reality that your companies are kicking back 50, 60, and some of the drugs we've analyzed, 80%? What's the role of that? Why is that occurring?
You're right. A lot of those rebates are being utilized by the PBMs to keep premiums stable. When they don't have access to those dollars, it does have, for some plans, the effect of having them pass on those costs to the patient. We've actually saw in this last round that the government had to step in Medicare Part D to give the payers some stabilization funds.
Oh, but I've been assured by the CBO that's not going to happen, Jocelyn.
Well, yeah. So it is a challenge, and we all have to think through that. We understand those dynamics. At the same time, we're really thinking about what's happening to the patients who do need to access medicines. The PBM should really be prohibited from receiving compensation based on the medicine's price, and that we understand the need to use rebates to keep premiums stable. However, PBMs shouldn't then be receiving additional compensation based on the medicine's price, and they should be passing on to the patients at the point of sale. So it shouldn't be the case that we should be shifting all of the burden to patients on the out-of-pocket costs. More and more plans are shifting from like a copay to a coinsurance, which is a much higher percentage. Patients are ending up being squeezed on both ends.
And how much of this problem is the way the system is currently constructed? It's almost like the patient is not really the customer. It's the person who owns the insurance premium is the customer. That's what they're competing on. Don't we have some perverse incentives in the system as it's currently constructed?
Yeah, I think pharma has definitely advocated that we need to realign those incentives to encourage PBMs to focus more on the patient and to ensure that the patients are the ones who are benefiting from some of these rebates more directly, because we're also creating disproportionate impacts. So patients who end up needing more medication, using more healthcare, end up having to pay a very disproportionate share versus the healthy patients who are not being as impacted by those out-of-pocket costs.
Yeah, Scott Gottlieb said it best once. He said, we have a perverse incentive now where the sick patients are subsidizing the healthy. It's kind of ridiculous. If you take 100 people in a room who are over 65 and on Medicare and say, how many of you are on specialized products? It's literally like 5 people in that room, 5%. 95% are not. It's a real issue where the incentives right now are pointing the wrong way. In this Congress, is it even on the topic? Probably. I mean, you guys are just trying to stay above water right now.
Well, we're still hopeful. I think at the end of the year, there was a package that had 4-corner alignment, and there were some really helpful provisions in that package to address some of these incentives. Unfortunately, that package did not pass, and a lot of those provisions didn't end up in the CR that was passed most recently. So we're still advocating with Congress to see if there's a path forward there, because we still strongly believe that those kinds of reforms would be beneficial.
So let's duck back a little bit and take a more helicopter view. From the 80s to the 2000s, if you looked at the sector broadly, it was really driven. SmithKline Beecham, a lot of these companies don't exist anymore. UK, Germany, France was 65% of the market. There's a famous Harvard study that I always quote that shows that it was 63% in the year 2000. Then what happens? The EU puts in a centralized procedure. They remove the individual countries with ties to the pharmaceutical industry from authorizing their own products. It goes to the EU, where all suddenly becomes a very bureaucratic health technology assessment-driven process. And then a year or two later, the Bush administration, with Doug Holtz-Eakin as the head of the CBO, passed the prescription drug benefit as an incentive to drive productivity in the U.S. And by 2010, 60% of pharmaceuticals are now made in the United States. Now it seems like every day I walk into this town, every time I'm here, my 1 week a month, there's just more nastiness being poured on the sector as a whole. What happened? Why did this opinion change from 2004, when everything's roses and milk and honey, and now everything is just thorns?
I think this is a complicated question.
got plenty of tape, Jocelyn.
Several things have happened. You don't know what you've got till it's gone. I think we have gotten to a place in a certain sense where we have lost a little bit of the wow factor when it comes to understanding what this industry is capable of doing. Pharma recently held a forum that looked at 25 years of innovation since 2000 to 2025, and there has been incredible advances. However, that problem that we just spoke about, where patients are getting more and more exposure to costs at the pharmacy counter, has caused people to be a lot more aware of what the price of that innovation is, because they're having to bear more of the brunt of it because the insurance is not working the way it's supposed to for them. And these misaligned incentives, a lot of the PBMs are taking 50% of the dollar. So instead of patients being able to benefit, they're being exposed to a lot more out-of-pocket costs. And so it's creating stress and anxiety for patients. And as a result, people are looking to the cost of the medicines rather than focusing on the benefit that these medicines are providing. We are in an era where a cancer diagnosis is not necessarily a death sentence. You can extend life. We've got cures for many diseases, hepatitis C, others. You've got gene therapies that are addressing the root causes of diseases, where you're providing hope for children who had no hope before. These are incredible advances, and I think as a society, we can afford that. We just have to figure out how to make sure that patients are not the ones who are increasingly having exposure to that, and in a way that is making them feel negatively about the healthcare system.
If you look back at the year 2000, for example, there were about 5-6 retirees for every working beneficiary. There were 5-6 beneficiaries for every worker in the U.S. economy. We're down to 3.5 to 3. It's going to be pushing 2. How much is this just being driven by, well, one, advances in technology? New technology doesn't always decrease costs. Sometimes investing in new technology is more expensive.
Yeah.
I mean, there's that. Better technology sometimes costs more. And 2, a lot of it's demographics. How much of this is just the system not responding to reality?
Yeah, that's a great point. Older Americans cost a lot more. Alzheimer's is an incredibly expensive disease.
Yeah, trillions of dollars now.
Trillions. So that is certainly a part of it. We have to figure out how to deal with an aging population in a more comprehensive way. We as an industry have been very focused on prevention, around trying to ensure that we are incentivizing and paying for the right kinds of care early enough so that we can prevent a lot of these later healthcare costs. But again, the system has to be oriented to really solve these problems holistically. And so far, I think we've not done an amazing job at all of that. I think there's more work to be done.
If you look at what Japan was going through 15 years ago, they started going down the pathway of Europe. They started bringing in NICE, National Institutes of Care Excellence, UK-style HTA review. They were really pushing down price within the context of their system. And then they started realizing, hey, wait a minute, the industry is moving away. And then they brought in what was called the Sakigake program in 2015, 2016 to try to push new efficient treatments, sort of like almost a moonshot, but for advanced therapies to deal with diseases of the aging using gene and cell therapies. Where is that disconnect coming here in the U.S.? Where's the political angle not meeting the fact that actually innovation could solve these problems? Where the Japanese have gotten hip to it. Here, we just seem to be getting more and more adversarial.
I think, again, it's that you don't know what you've got till it's gone. To have a flourishing biopharmaceutical industry, you really need a three-legged stool. You really need strong intellectual property protections, a very well-functioning regulatory system, and you need pricing and reimbursement that rewards and incentivizes continued innovation. Those three things have to be in place. When you look at markets like Europe, where innovation, the center of the biopharmaceutical industry shifted, again, the story that you're telling from Japan, same thing. Policies have consequences. Those policy levers are important. We need to maintain the framework that has set up U.S. as the global leader in innovation, and we need to ensure that we continue to maintain that policy framework. With the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, with the continued pressures on the industry, expansion of the 340B program, these PBM issues that we were discussing, all of those things are putting a lot of downward pressure. And now we're seeing even more pressure coming our way with potential tariffs and other things. Those things have consequences on the industry's ability to continue to innovate.
When we did the work on the IRA, we're seeing an exodus, and I can use that word. I mean, it's a statistically significant drop in R&D targeting the Medicare age population in small molecules. Before IRA, 75% of all medicines in Medicare Part D were small molecules. So make no bones about it. There is a huge impact from the Inflation Reduction Act. We can prove it now. It's peer-reviewed. It's published. Representative Greg Murphy and Senator Tom Tillis have proposed the EPIC Act to fix this. What exactly is the EPIC Act? What does it do?
Yeah, so under the Inflation Reduction Act, the timeline for when the drug price negotiation program kicks in and when the price setting would go into effect, it differentiates between small molecule medicines and biologics. And under the law, the policymakers decided that the small molecules should have price setting 4 years sooner than the biologics, just at year 9 instead of year 13. And what we know from how that market is supposed to function is that companies plan on having usually around 13 years of market exclusivity before generic competition. Now you're cutting off those last 4 years under the IRA. And when the law first passed, we anticipated that there would be some significant effects. And now your work and other work that we've seen is showing indeed this is really a big hit. And we have looked, there's been a few models that have shown that, in fact, the anticipated revenues tend to be around a third to even up to 50% between 9 and 13. Of course, that's going to have an ability on our companies' willingness and ability to keep investing in those products, or even to continue to innovating on products that have already been approved by the FDA. So a lot of those second or third indications, which can be critically important for patients, are also going to be avoided going forward.
And if you look at some of the other knock-on secondary impacts, you're seeing, for example, out of JP Morgan, we were saying that you're going to see a lot fewer neurology products with small molecules, and we were quite adamant about that. And some people, very clever people, aha, Dwayne, look, wow, there were 5 of these big 10 acquisitions were neurology. Ha, you're wrong. Ooh. And it's like, yeah, but that's depression and schizophrenia. Depression is 18-year-old female, schizophrenia is 24-year-old guy. No, we're not wrong. You are seeing the companies pivot to indications that are much, much lower than the Medicare average age. We're seeing the GLP-1s, obesity. I mean, that's 40, 45 years old. We're partying like it's 1999 all over again. Big, huge indications. The politicians that you're dealing with, are they aware of the implications of this? In that the IRA was sold as something to help the elderly population control their bills. And basically, they're going to get lower drug prices because there ain't going to be any new drugs.
Yeah, I think we're starting to show more evidence that's saying exactly this, that by reducing the investment in the products that are the very ones that would be beneficial for the Medicare population, that you could actually be increasing your costs over time. And I think that has created some more momentum for this EPIC Act, which would move the timeline up to 13 years for the small molecules. So both the biologics and the small molecules would have the price controls going into effect at year 13 instead of 9, which would be a massive improvement. Not to say that we like price controls at all. We would prefer to have a world without any of this in terms of the price controls. I mean, the IRA had some benefits, helped patient out-of-pocket costs. There's a $2,000 out-of-pocket cap. I think in the long run, for those kinds of patients who are utilizing a lot of healthcare and a lot of drug spending in Medicare, that's a good thing. But certainly the drug price setting provisions, not as positive. But at least if we could have 13 years for both, that would certainly blunt some of the really negative effects we've been talking about on the small molecules.
Obviously, a veto-proof majority in the House and Senate right now is just not on the cards. Getting through a very controversial fix on a very controversial piece of legislation like IRA, a lot of those politicians probably aren't going to be willing to put their head above the parapet. Do you think EPIC will end up in reconciliation? Is that possible?
We're certainly doing our best to make the case that it should be considered. Again, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed also through a reconciliation procedure.
That's true.
And we are making the case that it would be appropriate now. We have evidence around some of the negative effects of the policy, and there's an opportunity here to fix it. So we are certainly making the case that Congress should take that up.
Going back to some of your testimony in the Senate a couple months ago, you've been one of the first people to get hip to this idea and this sound an alarm in town that you saw a lot of this vertical integration on the not just the biologics, but also the biosimilars, where the insurers were starting to integrate in production as well as the hospital clinical setting. So you're getting this huge amount of vertical integration. Not only are you dealing with 80% of the market heavily, basically an oligopoly, with 3 players, a market oligopoly, but now you're also getting vertical integration across the sector where they're starting to own the channel after it passes from the drug company, particularly the biologics. The biosimilars are now also being owned. Blue Cross Blue Shield just signed a deal for their own version of Humira. We're seeing a lot of these deals. Why does that concern you, and why do you think it's happening?
Yeah, so when I first joined pharma 13 years ago in the Science and Regulatory Department, one of my roles was to implement the FDA provisions on the biosimilars, on the BPCIA, and to think about the science and to think about how to make sure these were safe, effective, and could be a good option for patients. It took a long time for us to see this market evolve.
Yeah.
And I had really been thinking more about the Part B, the specialty medicines. We were very focused on cancer docs and others. What has happened, though, as biosimilars have been available in the pharmacy benefit has been really eye-opening. That, in fact, the decisions around whether a patient would get access was not about the physician, but was about the formulary decisions being made by the PBM and the insurer. And they've really been driving coverage of these. And so we first saw the warning signs when the insulins, the low-cost insulins, tried to get coverage and couldn't.
Yeah.
And the problem has continued to accelerate. And as you said, now we have these PBM-affiliated products that are excluding other biosimilars who are trying to compete in the pharmacy benefit space. Humira, which many people were watching with great interest to see how that market would evolve. There were many, many entrants to the market, and they had no penetration for the first year at all until the PBMs were able to produce their own branded versions. And suddenly they were able to switch all of their patients, and now you're having large amount of uptake on the biosimilar. This was not on my bingo card for how this market would evolve. In the spirit of having a truly competitive market, I think not a great outcome for patients who had to wait for the plans to cover these lower cost options longer than they should have. And now they're not really getting the kind of robust choice we thought they would have once this market finally started to mature.
Part of the problem is the benefit redesign in IRA for the Part B plans, and particularly the products that have a Part D component as well. Because when you've switched the copay part, at least the amount in catastrophic, and I'm getting very in the weeds here for everyone, I'm apologizing, but when you get into this catastrophic phase, it was 80% covered by Medicare, i.e. the taxpayer, i.e. the government. Now people have said, oh, okay, we'll just pivot it over to the insurance companies, which sounds great on paper, but essentially you're adding a lot of risk there suddenly to the insurers, which is why we were not surprised at all. In fact, I'd been in your office and say, hey, you're going to have a big problem here with a big hole coming up for these bids. And so, not that I was going to say I told you so, but we saw it coming. And again, for our bingo card, it totally makes sense that they're vertically integrating, because if you actually look at the payment structures for these biosimilars, the only way they can make the numbers work is if they rebate back to themselves. It's the only way the math works. So you're creating these horrible disincentives to vertically integrate and try and grab revenue.
Yeah.
You're essentially forcing monopolistic practices on the sector, allegedly. And that's just my opinion. I don't want to trip into antitrust here. Sorry.
I mean, it's this, and then we're also seeing increased step therapy utilization management. So yes, I think that the incentives for plans to be managing their costs through additional means is definitely creating a lot of challenges in the system.
Here in D.C. this week, obviously it's all tariffs all the time. You folks have an exemption, at least that's what the word is right now, but we're also hearing that there are some things coming down the horizon, some battleships over the horizon line on the water. Do you think tariffs are going to be coming?
Well, historically, the pharmaceutical sector has always been exempt from tariffs.
Yes.
By the U.S. and other industrialized countries for decades. And so far, the Trump administration has not provided a lot of detail on their plans, but certainly we have seen that there is interest. I would say that pharma shares President Trump's goal of revitalizing American manufacturing. In fact, we already have a significant amount of investment here. We're one of the top manufacturers in the country. Several of our members have recently announced plans to build new manufacturing facilities in America. And a little known fact, nearly 2/3 of medicines taken by U.S. patients are actually produced here in America. That activity is generating $1.7 trillion annually to the U.S. economy and supporting millions of high-paying jobs. So we are a very strong contributor here. And tariffs would put a lot of pressure. Tariffs are a tax on the consumer, on the importer. And
in classical economic sense, yes, they are. Yes,
and
Jocelyn.
So,
yes.
Those costs have to be borne by the system. We are certainly committed to continuing to manufacture here. Again, tariffs have to be borne somewhere in the system. We have tried to convey to the administration that tariffs or other kind of policies like price controls or expansion of price controls or other kinds of things that would really put additional pressure on the margins of the industry would make it harder to continue to invest here. And that's certainly the opposite of what the industry would want.
There's a lot of manufacturing that comes through the U.S. from Europe, too. A lot of vaccine manufacturing in Europe. Europe has been hit in the teeth with a pretty big tariff. Right now, you're exempt. What concerns me, a lot of these cancer drugs have vertical inelastic demand curves, and your contracts that we've alluded to, this hole that emerged in Part D last year, which was fixed with a demonstration project of the Biden administration throwing $21 billion at Medicare to close this cost hole. That's for openers. If this happens, where you start tariffing imports, and the reality is a cancer drug that comes in at 25% suddenly jumped up in price, whether that's on patent or biosimilar or generic small molecule, it doesn't really matter. Those contracts are fixed through October with Medicare in particular.
Yep.
Are you concerned that this could cause some shortages that's completely out of the industry's hands? That's just the distributors won't be able to pass those costs off.
Certainly we saw during COVID that when you cannot meet trade demands and when we can't import things in a timely manner, that it certainly exacerbates risks of shortage. We were largely, from the innovative side of the industry, able to weather a lot of the supply chain disruptions of COVID because we had trusted trading partners, we had resiliency and redundancy in the supply chain.
You also have the ability to add margin.
That too.
Unfortunately, that's being taken away now.
Right, so it's going to get much harder. We have seen persistent shortages on some of the complex generics, the sterile injectables. It's underappreciated how difficult those margins are. This industry is highly risky. People forget sometimes because it's when you look at the successes, you forget what it took to get there. 1 out of 12 medicines that enter clinical development make it. Only 1. From a profitability perspective, we have data that showed that 2 out of 10 actually make their return on investment.
Yeah.
This is a very difficult industry with very tight margins that spends an incredible amount on R&D, hundreds of billions of dollars. Those margins are difficult. With all these additional pressures, you could certainly see the risk of additional shortages or other things, which would be a very negative outcome for patients.
If you look at the sector as a whole, 25 drugs are responsible for roughly 80%, 75%, depending on the year, the vast majority of the research available revenue and available free cash flow. It's really a very small segment of the market that's overwhelmingly responsible for the vast majority of the R&D. It's a very cash-intensive sector. If you look at biotech on its own, It's a negative 4% return on investment for the sector for the last 10 years. You don't actually make any money. And they're spending 40% of their cash flow. 40 cents out of every dollar gets plowed right back into R&D. Your sector is about 20 to 22%, depending on the year. Where do you think this is going to play out? What happens between now and the midterms? Where does this go?
If I had the answer to that...
we wouldn't be sitting here, we'd be investing. Yeah, I get it.
But the industry has a case to make and will continue to make it that this industry is one of the crown jewels of the U.S. economy. At the end of the day, having a robust American biopharmaceutical industry is a great thing for our patients. There's a lot of value here. This is an industry that wants to be able to contribute, wants to have high-value American jobs. And hopefully, I think we can continue to make the case to the administration that there's a positive path forward here where we can be a part of the solution, where we can have American manufactured medicines without causing unanticipated consequences. That's the hope. I think that's what we're going to keep making the case for.
Over-under odds?
It's hard to tell. It's a fast-moving administration with a lot of rapid changes. There's changes to the regulatory agency, the way that they've conceived of FDA. I think we're watching that carefully. A lot of different thinking, a lot of disruptive thinking. And certainly there's opportunity in that disruption. And so we are working very hard to find where that opportunity lies.
Jocelyn, it's always a pleasure. It's great to speak to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Dwayne.
The producer of the Vital Health Podcast is Dwayne Schultes. Our editor is Mark Brodeen. Our project manager is Caden Drake. The Vital Health Podcast is a production of Vital Transformation, LLC, copyright 2025.